Hello and welcome to another snake hole slithering and apocalypse triggering episode of What Happened, the YouTube style pop culture media show that regularly buries its oversized battle gauntlets into the juiciest cavities of the video game industry. And this week, we'll be doing just that as we navigate the various peaks and valleys of the development of Darksiders, a game and franchise that defied the odds and the literal end of days of its own publisher, and still managed to ride off from oncoming oblivion and into the hazy horizon of the future. It's a story of humble beginnings, excruciating growing pains, and a whole lot of perseverance that thankfully produced one of the most well-loved action-adventure franchises of the last few generations. So, saddle up your horse and clutch your Chaos Eaters as I answer the question, what happened to Darksiders Wrath of War?
Send me back.
Before we join War in his biblical apocalypse, let's first take a quick detour into the zombie apocalypse with Techland, who's sponsoring today's video, to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of Dying Light, the premier parkour-powered and undead-scoured open-world action franchise. Whether you're scavenging for tools and scraps during the day or dodging the hordes of horrific infected at night, you can expect a variety of new events, rewards, and free updates in both Dying Light 1 and 2 throughout the celebration, including new upcoming visual enhancements, a remastered soundtrack, and more for the original game that started it all. Dying Light 2, meanwhile, will see the popular roguelite co-op mode Tower Raid being permanently added into the game, along with all the new community requested improvements it's been seeing over the last few months, like more immersive audio, enhanced score, finishing moves, improved air mobility, and new gameplay customization options to better tailor the experience to your liking. So if you'd like to experience this harrowing, adrenaline-fueled sequel on the 10th anniversary of the franchise, now's the best possible time, because Dying Light 2 Reloaded Edition is currently 67% off, which is the biggest discount it's ever seen. But you better act fast, because this sale only lasts until February 10th. So make sure to hit the link in the description and pin comment below. Thanks again so much to Techland for sponsoring today's video, and now, without further ado, let's go from one dangerous undead wasteland and into another. The genesis of Darksiders starts with its original developer, Vigil Games, which, much like Darksiders itself, had more than its fair share of bumps along the road during its formation. Originally founded by programmer David Adams and comic book legend Joe Madureira, Vigil was born of the desire to create a unique fantasy game world that for various reasons never seemed to pan out in the different companies both creators had previously worked at. For Joe, after getting his feet wet doing illustrations for games such as Gekido, Urban Fighters, Darkened Sky, and every memorable PSM cover ever, joined up with Tim Donnelly of Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment fame to create, or not to create as it would turn out, Dragonkind, a fantasy action-adventure that heavily leaned into Joe's trademark art style. Despite it being formally announced by its developer Trilunar for the PS2 and Xbox in 2002, the studio just as quickly had to close its doors, as the startup simply couldn't find any outside investors, which was usually key in creating a new IP from the ground up. Meanwhile, David Adams, the co-founder of another obscure studio named Realm Interactive, was starting to develop an ambitious online action RPG called Exarch, which caught the eye of Richard Garriott's NCSoft, who had expressed an interest in publishing it. Through his connections in the game industry, David then contacted Joe to be their new art director, and since Dragonkind had been cancelled, the timing couldn't have been any better. Until it wasn't. As part of the publishing deal, NCSoft bought out Realm Interactive, but then dissolved the team before Exarch could be completed, shuffling the various staff members around to work on the likes of City of Heroes and Tabula Rasa. Obviously, both David and Joe were not very pleased with this outcome, as their dreams of developing their own fantasy action game had been unceremoniously cancelled twice. As luck would have it though, David had been secretly working on something he had been itching to show off, something that would become far bigger than he ever could have imagined. In his spare time, he had been making his own proprietary engine that could push more detail, geometry, and lighting effects than anything he had ever worked on before, and decided to invite Joe over to take a peek. The potential of this new engine excited them both that they quit NCSoft, eventually bringing along two other key staff members, animator Marvin A. Donald and level designer Ryan Stefanelli, which led to them founding their own studio, Vigilant Games. Which is something I would be saying to you if a third party hadn't already registered the name as a business. As revealed in the Darksiders documentary, which you can find linked in the description below, after a brief back and forth with said third party and a proposed and rather preposterous $50,000 price tag for the Vigilant name, they instead opted to just shorten it to Vigil, with Joe providing the artwork for the logo that's still synonymous with Darksiders to this day. The tiny team then started work with David's engine, designing levels, texturing rooms, and implementing a controllable character so they have a small but functional demo. At this point in time, they didn't really have a clear idea of the exact game they wanted to make, especially in terms of story and characters, but the codename they were using for this very early iteration of the engine was pretty clear in what their influences were, as internally they had named it Zoodoracapop, which stood for Zelda Ocarina of Death and Ratchet & Clank and Prince of Persia. Even with that, the subject matter was always changing. A robotically armed teenager fighting a vague source of evil, a duo who had to work together to save the day, and a hero that could morph into different animal forms, but none of these ideas really stuck. Then one day, Joe randomly suggested, how about controlling the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which provided the proverbial light bulb moment for the team, but would also kick off a series of events that would take them all to both hell and back. Joe's initial idea of a game focused on four fearsome horsemen had, funnily enough, already been under development in the early 2000s, which you can learn about in this video here, but had long since been cancelled before Vigil had ever even formed. And while the team quickly gravitated towards the idea, it still took a while before they would hone in on the Old Testament iteration they eventually landed on, as one of their earlier ideas was more of a X-Men style take on the material, with each horseman discovering their powers in a school-like setting. Of course, everyone was working for little to no money during this incredibly early phase of the project, which was something that had to change if they wanted to avoid the same fate that had befallen Dragonkind. So, with their war-focused demo running on a bulky custom-made mini-PC, Vigil went to E3 2005 to hopefully convince a publisher they were worth investing in, and as the story goes, every single big name politely passed on their concept. That is, except for one. Vigil took meetings with pretty much every publisher you can name, and by the end of the week, they were burned out by the numerous no thank yous and maybes they had received. Their last meeting of the trip happened to be with THQ, and the team weren't feeling any better about their project's future, as this meeting had been booked as more of a last-ditch Hail Mary style backup. Most teams would have thought the same way though, as at the time, THQ had worked almost exclusively with outside licenses, and very rarely took a chance on anything original. With that in mind, Vigil were even considering cancelling the meeting altogether, as they felt the chances that THQ would actually be interested in a dark, gory action-adventure would be catastrophically low. It's a good thing they didn't though, because what Vigil wasn't aware of was that internally THQ were trying to branch out with more original IP and to demographics they didn't usually touch. The THQ producer they had met with, however, Tim Campbell, was also beat to hell after taking a similar string of non-stop meetings and pitches that same week, but instantly perked up the moment Vigil handed him a controller and he started mowing down enemies as war. The team's flabber was then further gasted as Tim then invited even more THQ higher-ups to check out the demo, and after that, it wasn't long before a publishing deal was struck. Darksiders would become one of the premier new IPs THQ would start investing in, which meant the game and the team would need to grow considerably larger in both scope and numbers, which was a lot for any new company to have to contend with. While the demo only featured a playable war, Vigil's elevator pitch for the full game was something far, far more ambitious, as it would have entailed simultaneous 4-player co-op, with each player controlling a horseman. This concept was only briefly considered, however, as Vigil quickly realized they were absolutely insane to think it was something they could have pulled off in their first title working as a team, and so they scaled it back, focusing on just war as the sole protagonist. Even after making that change to a single-player experience, Vigil's original design for Darksiders was still much more grand than what was finally shipped to stores, as it featured a mammoth amount of traversable terrain, dungeons, and even characters that had to eventually be cut, both early and quite late into the project. In the July 2010 issue of Game Developer magazine, Timothy Bell, who served as Darksiders' producer on the Vigil side, broke down exactly what went right and what went very wrong during the game's lengthy life cycle, with one of the main issues being the dreaded feature/scope creep. The game was to be divided into overworld and underworld sections, and each of those sections was larger than the ultimate size of the final game. Clearly, our reach far exceeded our grasp. Some features, like the underworld, remained a part of the game design until late in the production cycle. Many of our scope problems can be traced back to the fact that we were a first-time studio that didn't clearly understand both the amount of work involved and the rate at which we'd be able to hire people onto the project. Much of that work was wasted when we ultimately had to abandon those areas of the game. Many of our artists and designers were frustrated and demoralized by having spent so much time on areas of the game that would never be seen by players. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the only big issue that would hamper Darksiders' development, because if you've been doing the math on when the first demo was presented at E3 2005 and when the game's final release date was, it would be roughly 5 more years before the apocalypse would finally be unleashed. Another big issue that Timothy Bell outlined in his post-mortem was Vigil's early reliance on strike teams, which were focused groups of senior staff members who were meant to solve specific problems and tasks that crop up during the development of any big game. Strike teams were still working on a game that was constantly getting its scope reduced, with whole regions and levels getting cut at any given time, which made keeping up to the day-to-day changes rather difficult. These strike teams at this early juncture were also not given very clear directions on what exactly they needed to prioritize, which is what caused them to drift onto less important areas, and unfortunately this wound up wasting a lot of time and resources. They weren't just a little off track, they were so far off the track that most of the work had to be completely redone. This situation infuriated the team as a whole and wreaked havoc with our dates. It would be a while before we tried using strike teams again. When we revisited the strike team concept towards the end of production, this time around we used significantly fewer people on each team, gave them extremely clear goals, and required daily updates on their progress towards those goals. The strike teams were then able to solve problems quickly and efficiently, and the demonstrable progress that they made each week provided a ton of positive reinforcement for everyone involved. The problems didn't stop there though, because once THQ had set up a state-of-the-art 23,000 square foot studio for Vigil, they went about constructing their very own Usability lab, which was going to provide focused feedback on the latest builds of Darksiders. But as described by Timothy Bell, this move turned out to be, and I quote, a disaster. Creating a new IP and expanding the team while still working on core technologies and engine improvements was all new stuff for Vigil, and the speed in which things were moving was hectic to say the least. So it shouldn't be too surprising that some managerial decisions were made a bit too hastily and without the proper vetting, which is exactly what happened with the usability testing lab. The idea was that Vigil would regularly bring in random gamers from in and around the Austin, Texas area where they were located to gauge feedback on Darksiders with extended play sessions. They would then use said feedback to implement improvements, but that didn't exactly go to plan. The hiring policies for these focus tests were apparently not very strict, so they wound up bringing in mostly fans of first-person shooters, whose main comments amounted to that they simply didn't like third-person action games and didn't enjoy Darksiders because of it, while other testers provided even less meaningful feedback than that. Setting up this in-house usability testing department caused THQ and Vigil both valuable time and money, so upon seeing how useless it had been, they instead decided to just hire an outside professional testing lab for the same purpose. Timothy Bell credited them with making valuable observations that ultimately improved the final game, such as redesigning the Choking Grounds environment from a confusing maze of narrow passages to a more navigable and atmospheric graveyard. So, after all those bumps and learning experiences, it was only in the last year of development where Vigil really began hitting their stride, identifying the areas and features that needed touch-ups and axing the ones that simply weren't working. This was in stark contrast to how they had started things off, where they were developing things backwards, designing the levels and dungeons first without considering the weapons, powers, and gear war would eventually need to accumulate, which led to a lot of avoidable reiteration of previously done work, like whole levels and puzzles, which again cost the team precious time. So with that experience now under their belts, the last 12 months of work on Darksiders saw huge changes, mostly for the better, across every area, and that included the cutscenes and story. Joe Mad was being stretched a little thin as both the game's art director and main creative force, while also being responsible for the narrative, so he eventually called upon another Joe, the equally legendary Joe Kelly, whom he had met during his time working at Marvel, to lend a helping hand. I asked Mr. Kelly about his time working on Darksiders, and he was more than willing to share the following with me. Joe did most of the world building well before I was involved and had a flow of the game already in mind. Looking back at my files, I think I helped flesh out some of the narrative backstory so that the story would hold, and once it was approved, I wrote the script. Then, after handing in this script, which was massive and had gotten approvals along the way, I heard through the grapevine that someone in charge at THQ held it up as an example of how not to write for games. Too many cinematics, too wordy, etc. A lovely blow to the ego, to say the least, but also strong disagree, especially since it was what Joe M. and I had wanted to make. After that point, Joe Mad took over the script since he was in-house, and it just made sense for him to do all the necessary cuts once they reduced scope, etc. All of the normal developmental stuff. All of these last-minute scope reductions and growing pains fortunately didn't affect the final version of Darksiders Wrath of War in any disastrous way, as when it did release on the Xbox 360 and PS3 on January 5th, 2010, it posted positive review scores with a strong 80 average, and selling over 1.2 million units, which was a great number for a new IP. This success, of course, would lead directly into the development of Darksiders 2, which was a whole other completely separate beast, and absolutely one I will tackle sometime in the future. Suffice it to say, the franchise went through the ringer in the subsequent years since the original's release, with THQ eventually closing down, and sadly, Vigil going along with them. Or did they? Yeah, sorta. Well, I'm sure most of you are aware of this. For those that aren't, the Darksiders franchise and the team members responsible for it went their separate ways upon Vigil's closing, splitting off into two different studios. Gunfire Games, headed up by David Adams, and Joe Mad's Airship Syndicate, with both of them eventually developing the sequels Darksiders 3 and Darksiders Genesis respectively. And while we currently don't know the exact nature of the new Darksiders project that was teased a few months back, it's at least comforting to know that despite all the hurdles and hell they had to go through, the Horsemen are still ready for at least one more ride. A big thanks goes to Joe Kelly for taking the time to add a bit more context to this episode. And if you're looking for additional detail into the Darksiders series and the people who made it, take some time out to watch the fantastic video by Gameomentary linked in the description below. And if you're hankering for some more harrowing and bloody adventures in the post-apocalypse, make sure to check out Dying Light 2 and all the festivities going on for the 10th anniversary celebration. And thanks once again to Techland for sponsoring today's video. And finally, if you know of any other cataclysmic capers in the video game or movie industries, hit me up in the comments below or take a calm, relaxing griffin ride into the heavenly temple that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!